Prime Minister Netanyahu was in the middle of his address at the United Nations when he took a sharp jab at Britain, mocking its heritage, its customs, and even questioning the strength of its military. A few delegates nodded along. Some even smirked. Then, something no one expected happened. A man quietly rose from the UK delegation, not a politician, not a diplomat, but a royal guard. Someone who had stood silently for years without ever uttering a word in public. Until now, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. What he delivered was a calm, measured warning spoken directly to the Prime Minister of Israel, right on the UN floor. Minutes later, the session was abruptly adjourned. Over 200 nations sat in stunned silence. The live feed was cut without explanation. So, what exactly did he say to bring a global forum to a standstill? Before we reveal the words that silenced a world leader, be sure to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The morning of October 15th, 2024, began like any other at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The autumn air carried the familiar tension of another General Assembly session, where world leaders would gather to debate, negotiate, and often accomplish very little. But this day would be different. This day would be remembered not for the speeches of presidents or prime ministers, but for the words of a man who was never supposed to speak at all. Warrant Officer Edward Lockhart of the British Royal Guard stood at attention in the Assembly Hall, his scarlet tunic immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, at 6 feet 2 inches tall, with 23 years of military service etched into every line of his weathered face. He embodied the centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard. To the casual observer, he was merely ceremonial, a living piece of British pageantry transported to the halls of international diplomacy. But those who knew military bearing recognized something else in Lockhart's stance. This wasn't just a ceremonial soldier playing dress-up. This was a man who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, who had earned the Military Cross for valor under fire, who had stood watch over the coffins of fallen comrades. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was discipline forged in the crucible of war. The session had been routine until Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took the podium. Netanyahu, known for his sharp rhetoric and political maneuvering, had been discussing military preparedness in the Middle East. But then, perhaps emboldened by the applause of his supporters, he had made a fateful decision to mock what he saw as the weakness of ceremonial military traditions. "Look around this assembly," Netanyahu had said, gesturing broadly with his characteristic smirk. "We see soldiers who stand like statues, pretty uniforms that have never seen combat, ceremonial weapons that have never been fired in anger. This is not military strength, this is theater. Real soldiers fight. They do not stand still as decorations for tourists to photograph." The words hung in the air like a challenge. In the British delegation, shoulders stiffened. Ambassador Richardson's knuckles whitened as he gripped his pen. The insult was deliberate, calculated, and devastatingly public. Netanyahu had not simply criticized a military tradition. He had questioned the very essence of service, duty, and sacrifice that these men represented. But if Netanyahu expected his words to pass unchallenged, he had gravely miscalculated. Because, standing 20 feet away, Warrant Officer Edward Lockhart heard every word. And in that moment, something shifted in the rigid discipline that had defined his entire career. Lockhart's mind flashed to Private Jenkins, 19 years old, who had died in his arms during a Taliban ambush in Helmand Province. Jenkins had been a member of the ceremonial guard before his deployment, spending months learning the precise movements, the unwavering discipline, the mental fortitude required to stand motionless for hours in the face of crowds, weather, and exhaustion. That same discipline had kept him calm under fire, had allowed him to hold his position when lesser men would have fled. He thought of Sergeant Morrison, who had transitioned from the Royal Guard to the SAS, carrying with him the unbreakable mental strength that ceremonial duty had instilled. Morrison had saved 12 lives in a hostage rescue operation, his steady nerves and absolute focus qualities honed during countless hours of ceremonial duty proving the difference between success and catastrophe. The memory of Corporal Williams flooded back, a young man who had served as a Queen's Guard for 2 years before volunteering for combat duty. Williams had been killed by an IED while protecting a convoy of Afghan civilians. His mother had told Lockhart at the funeral that her son had always said his time in the Royal Guard had taught him what it meant to serve something greater than himself. These were not decorations for tourists. These were warriors who had learned the deepest lessons of military service. that strength comes from discipline, that courage comes from duty, and that the greatest battles are often fought in silence. As Netanyahu continued his speech, seemingly pleased with his verbal attack, a young British diplomat named Thompson leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Easy for him to say. He's never worn a uniform himself, has he?" The comment was barely audible, but Lockhart heard it, and in that moment, something crystallized in his mind. He had spent his entire career following orders, maintaining discipline, respecting the chain of command. But there comes a time when a greater duty calls, when the honor of the fallen demands a voice. When silence becomes complicity with disrespect. The rules were clear. Ceremonial guards do not speak during official functions. They do not break ranks. They do not, under any circumstances, interrupt diplomatic proceedings. These protocols had been in place for over 3 centuries, since the time of Queen Anne. But sometimes, rules must be broken to uphold a higher truth. Netanyahu was building to his crescendo, his voice rising with confidence. In Israel, we know the difference between real military strength and empty pageantry. We do not waste our time with respect, Mr. Prime Minister. The voice cut through the assembly like a blade, clear, strong, and utterly unexpected. Every head turned toward the source, toward the British Royal Guard, who had just committed the most spectacular breach of protocol in United Nations history. Lockhart stepped forward, his boots echoing in the suddenly silent chamber. 300 years of tradition crumbled with each step, but his bearing remained perfect, his voice steady and controlled. "You are mistaken." The words landed like a thunderclap. Netanyahu's mouth opened in shock, his prepared speech forgotten. The entire assembly seemed to hold its breath, cameras swiveling to capture this impossible moment. British Ambassador Richardson half rose from his seat, his face pale with horror at the diplomatic catastrophe unfolding before him. The Secretary General's gavel remained frozen in midair. Security personnel looked uncertain. How do you remove a ceremonial guard who is speaking the truth? But Lockhart was not finished. 23 years of military service, of watching good men die for ideals that politicians took for granted, had led to this moment, and he would not waste it. "I have stood guard at the coffins of men who died for the idea of duty," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "I have served in wars that your bodyguards would flee from. Do not confuse ceremony with weakness, Mr. Prime Minister. Do not mistake discipline for decoration." Netanyahu's face darkened, his political instincts finally engaging. "This is highly irregular. I demand that you speak of real soldiers." Lockhart's voice cut through the protest like steel. "I have buried real soldiers, boys who will never see their families again because they believed in something greater than themselves. They learned that belief standing at attention for hours, learning that service means enduring discomfort without complaint, that duty means placing the mission above personal comfort." The chamber was electric with tension. Some delegates leaned forward, riveted by this unprecedented display. Others looked horrified at the breach of diplomatic protocol. But all were listening, because they recognized something genuine in Lockhart's words, something that had been missing from the carefully crafted speeches they heard every day. "Private Jenkins was 19 when he died in my arms in Afghanistan," Lockhart continued, his voice steady despite the weight of memory. "He had spent 18 months in the Royal Guard before his deployment. That discipline, that ability to stand unmoved in the face of chaos, it kept him steady when the Taliban attacked our convoy. He died saving 3 Afghan children, and his last words were about duty. Tell me, Mr. Prime Minister, was that empty pageantry?" Netanyahu's security detail stepped forward, but the Prime Minister waved them back. Perhaps he realized that stopping this moment would only make it more powerful, more memorable. Or perhaps he simply couldn't find the words to respond. "Sergeant Morrison served 2 years in the ceremonial guard before joining the SAS." Lockhart pressed on. The mental fortitude he learned standing motionless for hours in the rain. The absolute focus required to maintain perfect bearing while crowds jeered and cameras flashed. That same strength allowed him to remain calm. During a 12-hour hostage rescue operation, 12 lives saved because a ceremonial soldier had learned the deepest lessons of service. The British delegation watched in stunned silence as their ceremonial guard dismantled Netanyahu's argument piece by piece. This was not the rambling of an angry soldier. This was a masterclass in the true meaning of military service, delivered by a man who had lived it. Corporal Williams was killed by an IED while protecting a convoy of civilians. Lockhart's voice carried the weight of personal loss. His mother told me at his funeral that he had always said his time in the Royal Guard taught him what it meant to serve something greater than himself. He learned to endure hardship without complaint, to maintain discipline under pressure, to find strength in duty rather than personal glory. Netanyahu's face was rigid with controlled anger, but he remained silent. Perhaps he sensed that any response would only dig his grave deeper. So when you mock the uniform, Mr. Prime Minister, when you dismiss ceremonial service as theater, you mock the dead. You dishonor the memory of every man and woman who learned the deepest lessons of military service, while standing at attention, while enduring the public gaze, while serving their country in the most visible and vulnerable way possible. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, scattered applause began to ripple through the assembly. The French military attaché was the first to stand, his own experience with ceremonial duty lending weight to his gesture. The German delegation followed, then the Canadians, then others. Not universal approval. Many delegates remained seated, shocked by the breach of protocol but enough to send a clear message. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. "This is a disgrace," he said into his microphone, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled fury. "I will not be lectured by a soldier?" Lockhart's interruption was quiet but devastating. "By someone who has actually worn the uniform you dismiss, by someone who has stood over the graves of the men you mock." The Secretary General finally found his voice, his gavel rapping sharply against the podium. "The assembly will come to order. This is highly irregular." But Lockhart was already stepping back, his moment of rebellion complete. He returned to his position with the same perfect bearing he had maintained all morning, as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of his extraordinary breach of protocol was the electric tension that now filled the chamber. Netanyahu completed his speech in clipped, angry tones. His earlier confidence shattered. The insult that had seemed so clever, so politically advantageous, now hung around his neck like a millstone. He had been publicly challenged, publicly corrected, and publicly humiliated not by a rival politician, but by a soldier whose very existence proved Netanyahu's words false. The session was adjourned immediately. Netanyahu stormed from the chamber, his security detail forming a tight protective circle around him. But the damage was done. The moment had been captured by dozens of cameras, recorded by international media, and within minutes, it was spreading across social media platforms worldwide. "Royal Guard destroys Netanyahu," read one headline. "Soldier speaks truth to power," proclaimed another. The video clips went viral within hours, shared by veterans, military families, and ordinary citizens who recognized authentic courage when they saw it. In the corridors of the United Nations, the reaction was explosive. British officials scrambled to contain the diplomatic fallout, issuing carefully worded statements about regrettable breaches of protocol. While privately acknowledging the power of Lockhart's words, the Israeli delegation threatened formal complaints, demanded apologies, and spoke of damaged relationships. But outside the rarefied world of diplomacy, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Veterans organizations issued statements of support. Military families shared stories of their own loved ones who had served in ceremonial units before deploying to combat zones. The comments sections of news articles filled with testimonials from former soldiers who had experienced the same progression from ceremonial duty to combat service. Major General Patricia Hawthorne, commander of the British Army's London district, faced a dilemma that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Protocol demanded that Lockhart be disciplined for his breach of military bearing, but public opinion, veteran support, and the undeniable truth of his words created a political firestorm that no amount of military discipline could contain. 23 years of perfect service, she mused to her aide as they reviewed Lockhart's file. Military Cross for valor, commendations for leadership, not a single disciplinary action. And now this, Mum, her aide ventured carefully. The Prime Minister's office has been calling. They want to know what action we're taking. Hawthorne sighed. What action can we take? Court-martial a decorated war veteran for telling the truth. Punish a soldier for defending the honor of the fallen. The optics alone would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's political team was in crisis mode. The Prime Minister's casual dismissal of ceremonial military service had backfired spectacularly. Polling data showed his approval ratings dropping, particularly among military families and veterans. Opposition politicians were already preparing statements about his disrespect for military tradition and insensitivity to fallen soldiers. "We need to control the narrative," his chief of staff insisted during an emergency meeting. Frame this as a diplomatic incident, a breach of protocol, anything but what it actually was. But controlling the narrative proved impossible. The video of Lockhart's speech had taken on a life of its own, viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. Comment sections filled with stories from veterans who had served in ceremonial units, their testimonials creating a powerful counter-narrative to Netanyahu's dismissive words. Sergeant Major retired James Mitchell, who had served 10 years in the Royal Guard before 3 combat deployments, posted a video response that garnered over 2 million views. I learned more about being a soldier, standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace than I did in 6 months of basic training. The discipline, the mental fortitude, the absolute commitment to duty, that's what saved my life and the lives of my men when the shooting started. The following morning, Lockhart reported for duty as scheduled. No interviews, no public statements, no attempt to capitalize on his moment of fame. He simply appeared at his post, in full ceremonial uniform, and assumed his position with the same perfect bearing that had defined his entire career. But something had changed. The young soldiers who served alongside him looked at him with new respect, understanding that beneath the ceremonial exterior lay a warrior who had proven his courage in the most public way possible. Tourists who photographed him now did so with greater reverence, sensing that they were in the presence of someone who had transcended mere ceremony to become a symbol of authentic service. The British government found itself in an impossible position. Disciplining Lockhart would create a public relations nightmare and potentially damage morale across the entire military. But failing to act would seem to endorse breaches of protocol and military discipline. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Queen's private secretary reached out to the Ministry of Defense with a carefully worded suggestion. Her Majesty was particularly moved by Warrant Officer Lockhart's defense of military tradition and the honor of fallen soldiers. Perhaps a commendation for his years of exemplary service would be appropriate. The message was clear. The monarchy itself was backing Lockhart's actions, framing them not as a breach of discipline, but as the highest form of service, defending the honor of the dead and the integrity of military tradition. Netanyahu, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a political quagmire of his own making. His attempt to project strength by mocking ceremonial military service had backfired spectacularly. Military veterans organizations in Israel began questioning his own service record, his understanding of military culture, his fitness to lead a nation where military service was mandatory. The story continued to evolve in unexpected ways. An investigative journalist uncovered the fact that Netanyahu himself had served in a rear echelon unit during his military service, never seeing combat, never experiencing the crucible of war that he claimed gave soldiers their legitimacy. The irony was devastating. A man who had never faced enemy fire lecturing a decorated war veteran about the meaning of military service. 3 days after the incident, the United Nations released a carefully worded statement acknowledging the irregular nature of the proceedings, while noting that all perspectives on military service deserve respectful consideration. It was diplomatic language that said nothing while acknowledging everything. The real impact was felt in the countless conversations that followed. Military families shared the video at dinner tables, explaining to their children what it meant to serve with honor. Veterans groups organized ceremonies honoring both active and ceremonial service members. Military academies incorporated Lockhart's speech into their curricula as an example of moral courage under pressure. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the institution of the Royal Guard itself. Applications for ceremonial duty increased by 300% in the months following the incident. Young soldiers who had previously viewed such assignments as dead-end postings now understood them as opportunities to learn the deepest lessons of military service. Major Collins, who commanded the ceremonial unit, noted the change in his annual report. The men serve with a new sense of purpose, understanding that their role is not merely decorative, but foundational to military culture. They have learned that standing at attention is not passive but active, not empty but meaningful, not ceremonial but essential. The ripple effects extended far beyond the British military. Ceremonial units around the world reported similar increases in applications and improvements in morale. The French Republican Guard, the Vatican Swiss Guard, the Greek Presidential Guard all found their ranks swelling with soldiers who now understood that ceremonial duty was not a step down from combat service, but a parallel path to the same destination, the complete embodiment of military virtue. Netanyahu's political career never fully recovered from the incident. The video of his dismissive comments, followed by Lockhart's devastating response, became a defining moment that opponents used to question his judgment, his understanding of military culture, and his fitness for leadership. While he survived the immediate political fallout, the damage to his reputation among military families and veterans proved lasting. 1 year later, Lockhart was promoted to regimental sergeant major, the highest rank available to a non-commissioned officer. The promotion ceremony was attended by hundreds of soldiers, veterans, and dignitaries, all of whom understood that they were witnessing not just a career milestone, but a validation of the principles he had defended. In his brief acceptance speech, Lockhart remained characteristically modest. "I served for 24 years before I spoke publicly. I hope to serve 24 more in the same spirit, with discipline, with honor, and with respect for those who came before us." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for fallen soldiers, during which Lockhart stood at perfect attention, his bearing unchanged despite his newfound fame. In that moment, observers understood that his promotion had not changed him, it had simply recognized what he had always been, a soldier in the truest sense of the word. The story of Warrant Officer Edward Lockhart became required reading at military academies worldwide. It was studied not just as an example of moral courage, but as a masterclass in the proper response to injustice. His words were quoted in ceremonial speeches, inscribed on memorial walls, and passed down through generations of soldiers who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply the truth, spoken with quiet authority by someone who has earned the right to speak it. The United Nations never formally changed its protocols regarding ceremonial guards, but in the months that followed, the bearing of such soldiers seemed different, more purposeful, more dignified, more consciously aware of their role as representatives of military virtue. They stood not just as symbols, but as guardians of principles that transcended national boundaries: duty, honor, sacrifice, and the willingness to speak truth to power when the moment demanded it. In the end, Netanyahu's attempt to diminish ceremonial military service had achieved exactly the opposite of his intention. Instead of exposing weakness, he had revealed strength. Instead of demonstrating superior understanding, he had displayed profound ignorance. Instead of projecting leadership, he had shown the poverty of his own character. And in that moment of moral clarity, when protocol and politics demanded silence, Warrant Officer Edward Lockhart had spoken 3 words that would echo through military history: "You are mistaken." Simple words, spoken with quiet authority, that reminded the world that true strength comes not from mockery, but from service, not from politics, but from principle, not from speeches, but from the willingness to stand in perfect silence or in perfect truth for something greater than oneself. The guard had spoken, and the world had listened, and in listening, they had remembered what it truly means to serve.